Around the end of November, we received a little card in the mail that was dealing with our health insurance plan that we have. It was telling us that coming up in this next year, we would have an option in our health care plan. One, a better option, and the other, a not-so-good option. And the encouragement would be, obviously, to take the better option, because between the two, the out-of-pocket expenses changed quite a bit. The total out-of-pocket nearly doubled. Your deductible nearly doubled. And so Plan A was truly quite a bit better than Plan B. But to get Plan A, you have to earn a certain number of points. And that involves taking some blood work and taking a couple trips to the doctor, all of those good things. But then, other than that, there are some things that you have to do to take care of your health as incentive. Now, you can see the wisdom of the insurance company, because they realize that if they can get you to be healthier on a more attractive plan, they have to pay out less money. Therefore, they can keep more money, and at the end of the day, they end up ahead of the game, probably. But there's incentive for us as well as those who are insured to maybe live a healthier lifestyle and do the things that we need to do to earn the points so that you can pay less in your premiums. Or we don't have to pay the premiums, but the premiums ultimately coming down to what we pay in the deductible and total out-of-pocket and all of those things would be less. Now, one of the things that you have to do or can do to earn points is to have some kind of an exercise plan. Now, a couple of years ago, this church was very generous on Pastor Appreciation Day and gave me one of these, a Fitbit. Anybody wearing one today? Few people have steps. Should we compare who has the most? I hit 10,000 in Whitehall when I was preaching today, so you may have a little ways to catch up. I didn't do that all while I was preaching, though. Sermon wasn't quite that long. I got up early this morning and took a nice walk, which it is a gorgeous time to take a walk in the morning. So, and really nice today. 32 degrees, no wind, just a beautiful morning to be out. But anyway, the encouragement is that you would take more steps, exercise a little more, and your Fitbit somehow gets tied in with whatever they have, and they keep track of your steps, and you get so many points for every 5,000 steps you take, and therefore you can earn points and therefore earn a better insurance policy. Now, I typically don't wear this watch except in the morning when I am exercising. Then I put my other watch on for the rest of the day. But I wore it today for the purpose of just what we're doing here. Because all of a sudden, before we get this insurance thing, I did my steps, and occasionally I take a look and say, well, I got 10,000 today or whatever. But I really don't care how many steps I take in a day. I don't need to wear it all day, every day, because that isn't something that matters that much. But now all of a sudden, those steps become what? They become more important. They actually become valuable. If my deductible doubles if I don't do it, I am saving something by doing it. Each one of those steps has value to it. Have you ever thought of your steps that you take each day having value before? Is there value in those steps that you take and the places that you go? I want to go back in time today, back to November 1st of 2014. That day, I preached a sermon that was entitled, Just a Walk Across the Room. The value of the steps that we take. The centerpiece of that sermon was a story about one of our church family who had taken a few steps, very valuable steps, across a room. Nearly 5 years ago, at Mount Ellis Alumni Weekend, Charles Page was in a group of people who were visiting together. If you know Charles, it isn't a hard thing for him to be in a group of people visiting. But that day, as Charles looked across the room, he saw a man that was standing there all by himself. Didn't have the group surrounding him, didn't have the people to talk to, just standing there by himself. That man's name was Randy Flint. Many of those who have been in this church for a while know of that name. Randy was there just because his dad had wanted to go to Alumni Weekend, and Randy had brought him. As Charles looked across the room that day, he decided that there was a better place than in his little box, his comfort zone. And so he walked out of his comfort zone across the room, and he began to engage and talk with Randy. That next Sabbath, Charles came to me with a smile on his face and a sheet of paper. It had Randy's address and his phone number. Randy lived in Whitehall, and that next Wednesday before prayer meeting in Whitehall, I was in Randy's house. Had no idea who he was, had never met him before. Found out that he had attended Mount Ellis Academy, but he had walked away from the church. He was addicted to drugs. He was an alcoholic, and his own words would tell you he had lived his life any way he wanted, and he really didn't have anything to do with God. But something had changed when Charles took the time to walk across that room. And when I preached that sermon on November 1, a year and a half later, it was celebrating the fact that Randy Flint had started to attend church in Whitehall. No longer doing drugs, no longer drinking, trying to finish off a smoking habit. I find it interesting that those are the things we gravitate to, as if those are the things that matter. You know what the big news was? Randy had accepted Jesus back into his heart. And I would share with Charles from time to time updates on Randy. This last year, I was able to share with him that Randy had been baptized. A walk across the room. In that sermon, we asked the question, could it really be that simple? Could it be that easy to change someone's forever destiny by just simply taking a few steps across the room? And the answer to that question can only be one thing. It can only be yes, because that's exactly what Jesus Christ did for each and every one of us. I want to read you one quotation from that sermon back on November 1st, and then I promise for those that remember it, we won't go back there anymore. You'll get new material from here on out. But I want to go back one more time for this quotation. This comes from Pastor Bill Hybels. He says, at a certain point in history, Jesus Christ himself left the marvelous fellowship of the Trinity and the worship and adoration of the angels. He wrapped himself in human flesh, and he walked across the cosmos in order to stretch out a hand to people like you and me. It was when we were helplessly in the throes of sin that Christ extracted himself from the ultimate circle of comfort, heaven itself, to step across time and space to rescue us. Jesus took a decided step toward the ungodly, embracing the worst that this planet had to offer, and embracing them with an offer of acceptance, love, and forgiveness. Jesus Christ took for what him was a simple walk across the room, right? His steps are a little bit bigger than ours. A walk across the room for Jesus is a walk across the universe. And he did so for you and I, to show us acceptance, love, and forgiveness. I want to focus here on a couple of the words here. Jesus took a decided step toward the ungodly, embracing the very worst that this planet had to offer. Stop and think a moment. Can you think of some of the very worst that this planet has to offer, that Jesus came to save? Can you think of someone in our world that would fit that category, the worst of the worst, that even for that one, Jesus Christ came to show acceptance, love, and forgiveness? I decided this week I would see, is there a story in the Bible that illustrates Jesus coming to save the worst of the worst? And we want to go in our Bibles today to Mark chapter 5. We're going to begin by looking at the first 5 verses. Mark chapter 5, page 994 in your pew Bible. And we'll look at the first 5 verses. Again, that's Mark chapter 5. As you're turning there, this is a story we know, but there's one little thing we have to take note of here. This story is included in Matthew's gospel as well as Luke's, on top of what Mark does here. And in Matthew and Luke's gospel, there are 2 demonics that Jesus comes and ultimately heals. Mark only talks about one. We don't want to let that distract us today, because Mark probably had good reason for doing that. Perhaps this was one that he knew personally. Who knows why he would have just mentioned one, but that's what he does, and we will understand that as we go through the story. But I choose Mark's account because it is the most intimate of the 3. It gives us the most details about what took place that day. And so we begin here, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. They went across, speaking of Jesus and the disciples, went across the lake to the region of Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. Now, I want you to think for a minute. Can we think of humanity in much of a worse place than this man that we read about? That's pretty much the worst of the worst, right? After all, this man is filled with who himself? He's filled with the devil himself. This is the worst of the worst. This is what Bill Hybels is saying. Jesus came to go to the very worst. And I have another question for you. How many of you, when I ask, could you think of someone who would fit that category of the worst, that Jesus came to show acceptance and love and to show forgiveness to? How many of you included yourself in that list? How many thought of you when I ask about the worst? It's interesting, when we think of the worst that Jesus came to save, we seldom think about ourselves. I find it interesting and rather refreshing that when Paul looked at himself and what Jesus had done, he considered himself to be the chief of all sinners. And perhaps when we read this story, we see somebody who is far away from us. And yet, how many times are we like this demonic? When the chains of what we know to be right cannot contain us and we go our own way? How many of us have, as Christians, have come to the place in our experience where we wonder if we are doing enough good, and we look at ourselves and we forget who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, and we begin to beat ourselves up because it seems like we just can't get past the same place. See, I think we are a whole lot more like this man that Jesus encountered than sometimes we think ourselves to be. And so for me, I find it easy to place myself in this story. A self that too often goes back and fights the same battles. Case in point, just yesterday, as I was gassing up my car for the weekend and went to check my oil, I noticed that somehow, perhaps over the bumpy, icy roads, my oil cap had come off inside of the car there. And therefore I checked my oil and found out that there was really no oil on the dipstick, and I thought, well, it seems like it's going to be a good day to change my oil. Wasn't in my plans, but that's where I went, and went to the store. Sandy had some things to pick up, so she went with me. And being handicapped in the way that I am without these, when it came time to pick out the oil filter, I didn't remember the number. And so I had to leave it up to somebody with good eyesight, because if you look at those books that have your oil filter number on there, it's as small a type as you can possibly use. And I got halfway across the store and still couldn't read it, so she had to do it. Got home, went through the oil change, everything went as it was supposed to. Backed the car down off of the little ramps there and looked on the ground, and lo and behold, all of the oil that I had just put in my car was all over the driveway. And so I looked underneath, and where the oil filter was where all the oil was now coming out. This isn't a place that I wanted to go, but guess where I immediately went? My lovely wife, who we had just celebrated 32 years of marriage the day before, got to have that question asked of her. Are you sure that you read the right number? In other words, whose fault is it? Certainly wasn't mine. I didn't pick out the oil filter. And though I didn't do anything over the top, I certainly let her know that more than likely it had been her responsibility. Do you know how easy it is for us in our life to slip into that place where we selfishly think that we can do no wrong and it is always someone else? I am so quickly reminded so often in my life that I can be this man. I can be one that over and over again breaks away from where God wants me to be and reverts to the selfish person that can point at you and say, that's your problem, not mine. And as is usually the case, as I got back under and took the old filter off to see what was going on, I discovered that the filter I had taken off, the one that was in the garbage can now, the rubber gasket had come off and stayed attached to where you screw the oil filter on. So when I put the new one on, I had a nice big gap between where it was supposed to be snugged down to. And when I pushed the gas pedal down to rev up the engine and get the oil through so I could really check what level it was, it pushed a lot of oil through and out all over my driveway. And I was quickly reminded that if there was anyone who needed to take responsibility, it was me. How easy it is for us to break away from what God wants us to be into what we so naturally are. And in this man's life, he is the worst of the worst. But Jesus comes, just as he came from heaven to this earth to save you and I. Jesus went across Galilee with a purpose and a mission, and it was to meet that man that day. Jesus took a walk across the room. And as we continue in the story, we see what happens here. Verse 6 and 7 here. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" King James says he ran to Jesus and he worshiped him. I find that to be rather amazing. A man that everyone else runs away from, a man who chases everyone away, the worst of the worst, who can't even be bound in chains, a man who is literally filled with the devil himself, comes running to Jesus and falls on his knees worshiping him. What in the world could cause that reaction? Think about the demon, the devil inside of him. Could he stop him from going and worshiping Jesus? This is an incredible thing in the story. The devil himself, when this man sees Jesus, the devil himself can't stop him from going and doing what? Going and worshiping. And the devil himself, though he would not be there to worship Jesus, can do nothing else but also fall and submit to one he knows to be the true God. How can that happen? How can it be that someone we would look at would have nothing to do with Jesus, filled with the devil himself? How could it be that he would be on his knees worshiping literally in a matter of a moment? Look at the beginning of verse 6. This is all that the Bible tells us happens. When he what? When he saw Jesus. No sermons, no lectures, no words that were telling him, hey, you probably should hang around with some better folks than those demons. No lectures on, hey, do you know that the body is the temple of God? You should take a little better care of it. No sermons, no lectures, no words. He saw Jesus and he came and he what? Worshipped him. What it tells me is it must be an incredible thing when one truly sees who Jesus is. When somebody truly sees who Jesus is, there is something that happens in their lives. Last week, we talked about going out and sharing what Jesus has done for us. I have heard numerous times from Christians, from people within these walls, that all sounds good, but the problem is out there we live in a world that wants nothing to do with Jesus. The vast majority of the world wants nothing to do with Jesus. Have you heard that before? Have you ever felt that way before? At times the world looks that way, doesn't it? That really, for the most part, the world wants nothing to do with Jesus, and yet Jesus himself, looking at the world that we live in, says the harvest is what? Plentiful. Jesus seems to indicate that the problem isn't a lack of people who ultimately would want to have something to do with Jesus. He says the problem is a lack of what? Laborers, people who are willing to go and share. And I wonder in my heart today, what would happen in our world, this world that doesn't seem to want to know Jesus, what would happen if God's church really went out into the world and gave a picture of who Jesus is? Do you suppose that might do something? Look at this man. Would you have said he would be one that wanted anything to do with Jesus? We'd have said, no way. He's a lost cause. Leave him up in the mountain in the caves where he is. Just keep him away from us. He'll never have anything to do with Jesus. And yet there is an incredible thing that takes place when we see Jesus. It changes hearts. And I wonder today if God's church got serious about coming out of its comfort zone, our little box where we're comfortable, and we were willing to take a few steps across the room to tell somebody what Jesus Christ has done for me, to bear witness of what the gospel of Jesus does to a life. I wonder if we might be able to look at the world in a little different way. I wonder if the world is really that adverse to Jesus, or we are just adverse to leaving our little box and following what God has called us to do. Well, we know the story from here. The demons are a little concerned about being in the presence of Jesus. If we're going to be cast out, well, cast us out into these pigs. And there they go. And there goes the pigs. Over the edge into the water, they all drown. The report gets back to town. And we want to pick up the story here in verse 15 down through 17, Mark 5 and 15 to 17. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. And then the people began to plead with Jesus to do what? To leave, get away. Well, there's your answer, Pastor Jim. There goes your wondering, your theory. That's the world we know. Get Jesus where? Out of here. We don't want anything to do with Jesus. Even in the presence of a man who you knew to be something totally different than what you see now. Sane and in his right mind, well-dressed, not the guy that was cutting himself, breaking out of chains. You see that right there, and yet you tell Jesus to do what? Go away. That's the reason it doesn't work, Pastor Jim. That's the reason that we don't go out and share, because the world really doesn't want anything to do with Jesus. And I would say, really? Because that's not what this story reads. Let's finish the story. Verses 18 down through 20, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." Let's just stop there for a minute. Last week we compared two gospels. Matthew 24:14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to all the world as a witness. And then what? Jesus is going to come. And we talked about a difference between the gospel of the kingdom, which is the gospel of what Jesus has done for me in my life, bearing witness what the gospel has done for me, as opposed to the gospel of the church that we so often revert to. This is what you got to do. This is how you got to act. This is what you have to do to be like who? To be like us. And as we shared last week, I don't find anywhere in the Bible where we're told to share the gospel of our church, but we are told to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And at the end of the day, those should be what? Those should be the same. But over the course of history, since Jesus preached the kingdom of God, and out of that kingdom came a church, from that time till now, somehow we have lost sight of what the gospel is. We would rather preach to people about what they need to do, what day they need to worship, what they need to eat, what they need to do, and this and that, and all of these things, so that they can be just like us. But Jesus doesn't say, go and preach that to this man. He says, go back to your family or your friends and tell them about what? What Jesus has done for you. That is the gospel of the kingdom. So the man went away and began to tell in Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all of the people were what? Amazed. Now Jesus told him to go back. King James says friend, my Bible says family. But it says that he went back and he preached in where? If you listen closely, it says the Decapolis. That's 10 cities. That's a region, not just a few family and friends. That's a region. This man went back to these 10 cities and he began to share what Jesus Christ had done for him. Do we know what happened because of that? Well, Mark gives us a hint. Let's just turn over a few pages here. Mark chapter 7. And we want to just read 3 verses here. We're not going to read all of the stories that go with. But verse 31 and then 37, and then we'll jump to chapter 8 quickly. But Mark chapter 7 and verse 31, this just gives us some direction and guidance as to where Jesus is. It says, then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of what? Decapolis. Now that just happens to be where the demonic or demonics went and began to preach what Jesus had done for them. And verse 37 says, Jesus came to them and began to share with them. Verse 37, people were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So we have one large group of people who are amazed and overwhelmed with who? Jesus. No longer in that region were they telling Jesus to what? Go away. They were amazed and overwhelmed at what Jesus was doing. And then look at the first verse in chapter 8. During those days, while he was still in the same region, by the way, another large crowd gathered. So this tells us that this isn't the first large crowd to come to Jesus. It is another large crowd. It says another large crowd came to Jesus and gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him, and the rest of the story is Jesus feeds how many people? Well, we know there's 4,000 men, probably 8,000 to 10,000 people total are fed. And they are amazed at who Jesus is. And Desire of Ages says this about this experience. For a few moments, go back to that's the next quote here. We will start over. Though the Savior himself departed, the men whom he had healed remained as witnesses to his power. Those who had been mediums of the Prince of Darkness had become channels of light, messengers of the Son of God. Men marveled as they listened to the wondrous news. A door was opened to the gospel throughout that region, and when Jesus returned to Decapolis, the people flocked about him, and for 3 days, not merely the inhabitants of one town, but thousands from all the surrounding region heard the message of salvation. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Thousands from all of the region came to hear the message of salvation from Jesus because they had heard the message of what God had done in somebody's life. Can it happen to us? Back to the Desire of Ages here, where I tried to go. For a few moments only, these men had been privileged to hear the teachings of Christ. Not one sermon from his lips had ever fallen upon their ears. They could not instruct the people as disciples who had been daily with Christ were able to, but they bore in their own persons the evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. They could tell what they knew, what they themselves had seen and heard, and felt of the power of Christ. This is what everyone can do whose heart has been touched by the grace of God. This is what who can do? Everyone. Who does that include? It includes every single one of us. John, the beloved disciple, wrote, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled as the word of life, that which we have seen and heard, we declare unto you. 1 John chapter 1 and verses 1 through 3. As witnesses for Christ, we are to tell what we know, what we ourselves have seen, heard, and felt. If we have been following Jesus step by step, we shall have something to point to tell concerning the way in which he has led us. We can tell how we have tested his promise and found the promise true. We can bear witness to what we know the grace of Christ has done for who? For us. This is the witness for which our Lord calls, and for want of which the world is perishing. What witness has God called us to give? What he has done in our lives. The gospel of the kingdom. And to share that gospel may just mean that we have to leave our little box where we have for so long been and take a few steps across the room. Sermon title today was One More Walk Across the Room. Tomorrow we will be celebrating a life that is no longer here with us. A wonderful example of one who took a walk across the room. One more walk across the room begs the question, who will go now? On a clear night, you can look up into the heavens and we see so many stars we can't imagine how many of them are there. But what we don't realize, that all the time that we are looking, there are stars that are dying and are no longer there. Become black holes. What would happen if that was the only thing that was happening in our heavens? Bright stars fading out. Eventually our heavens would not be nearly as glorious, would they? But in the wonder of God's creation, for those stars that burn out, there is always a new star that is born. One more walk across the room begs the question, who will be the one to take that walk? Who will be the next star to shine brightly in the darkness? My friends, our world is desperate for people who are willing to follow Jesus' example, but also to follow the Charlie Pages of the world, who are willing to take that walk across the room. I'm going to challenge you today. We are at the beginning of 2018. We have a whole year in front of us. What if this year, each and every one of us committed ourselves to walking across the room for just one person? Just one. Not asking you to go out and change the world, just to simply take a few steps to one person that God lays on your heart that might need to know something good about what Jesus has done and what Jesus can do. It's not a hard task because God is not asking you to convert them or change them or do anything of the sort. All He's asking you to do is walk across the room and share something that Jesus has done for you. Let them see Jesus. When the demonic saw Jesus, something incredible happened, did it not? There were no sermons, there were no words. It was a visual sight of Jesus, and in seeing Jesus, there is something incredible that happens. And if in our life we could be like the Peter and Johns as they were before the Sanhedrin, and they were noticed that, you know what, these guys have been with who? These guys have been with Jesus. If we gave the world a chance to see that we have been with Jesus, a world to have the chance to see Jesus in us, what might happen? So I want us today to consider, I can't make you do anything, but I am asking you to pray and ask God just to put one person in your life this year that you can walk across the room and share Jesus with. Do you know what the potential is if they see Jesus in your life? That at the end of this year, there would be another person for every single person who is in here attending church. Does that seem out of this world impossible? I hope it doesn't to you after the story we looked at today. Because when you see Jesus, incredible things can happen. When we show the world Jesus, by the grace of Jesus, incredible things can happen. The harvest is plentiful. Jesus is looking for a few Charlies to take a walk across the room, to understand the value of what just a few steps to go over and share Jesus can mean. One more walk across the room. Wouldn't it be an amazing thing when Jesus comes again to share with Charlie what His influence has done for this church? That we all have taken a walk across the room.